La 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 la. Do I sound good?
You
sound good. I got the vibrato happening.
Yeah, that's great. Are we recording right now?
Yeah.
Oh,
No, because I always like to catch the vocal warm-ups.
Yeah, that's good. It is 90 degrees today in New York City, and it's like the first day I think in like 5 months I have not worn a jacket.
Unique New York. Unique New York.
Yeah, it's
sibilance.
The summer is here. This is good.
It's awesome, actually. We can get a tan. We can get Zika. It's all there for us.
New smells on the subway. It's an amazing thing.
I've been really inspired by all the researchers we've been having on, recently.
Yeah.
And I tried to do a study. So I've been asking people
in your free time.
I've been doing a statistical sample of the times in conversation it's appropriate for me to say "Yas Queen." Yeah. So I've been collecting those answers.
Have any journals picked this up?
Yeah, it's going to go in the Journal of Emergency Disasters. I'm really aiming for disasters, but it turns out it's pretty much none. There's no situation where I can use that phrase.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can work it into the podcast and really get it to the vernacular of emergency management.
That's right. It can be the next acronym, Youth Association Situation. Or I don't think I can take that any farther.
All right, well, so we have another great episode tonight, and let's just jump right into it. I'm going to read some of our guest's bio. His name is Rafael Lemaitre, and he has over 16 years of experience doing national and international public relations and crisis communication work. He served in 3 presidential administrations. He was appointed by the Obama administration as senior advisor for media and communications to the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol. He, in 2010, was associate director for public affairs for the Office of the National Drug Control Policy. And in 2014, he was appointed to FEMA as Director of Public Affairs.
Which means 2 things.
Yes.
Here are the 2 most important things about Rafael's biography. Okay, A, he worked for Craig.
That's
and
right.
that means we can pump him for news about Craig.
That's right.
And 2, he participated, and this is true, in a big block of cheese day, which I thought was only a myth from the West Wing, but it turns out it was a real thing,
really
and he did it.
He can also answer all of our burning questions on was West Wing true to life.
That's right.
Did it really happen?
That's right.
Welcome, Rafael. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, guys. I can't tell you how excited I am to join 2 more fellow Craig fanboys on the air here. It's going to be really cool.
2 more to the fan club. That's right.
And we're going to talk so much about that. We're going to talk about your career, your time at FEMA. We're going to talk about disaster deductibles. We're going to talk about Matthew. We're going to talk about Flint. So there's so much here. We better just dive in.
Yeah, let's just get into it.
We're going to dive in. We're going to swim.
Yeah, I guess. So to start with, Rafael, how did you get involved? How did you start your career? And specifically, how did you get involved in disaster preparedness and response?
I wish I could say that I had a really good idea of what I was going to do after I graduated college, and that I had wanted to propel myself into politics and work at the highest levels of government on drug policy and emergency management and immigration reform. But the truth is, it was a whole lot of luck and some hard work. I think my big break was in 1998, a long time ago now, when I got an internship at the White House, working for then drug czar Barry McCaffrey, who you've probably seen on TV a bunch of times. He's an NBC News commentator. Yeah. And so that's kind of how I started my career. He took me under his wing. And I'll tell you, working for a 4-star general as your first job is really something else.
That's amazing.
You basically started with the hard drugs, and you just went on from there.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah, but, there was no gateway career change. It was straight to the hard stuff.
Right.
Yeah, I was totally baptism by fire. But I guess the good part was that, I just got thrown into it. And after working at the White House for quite some time, I decided I'd always been involved in politics. And so I worked on President Obama's 2008 campaign as a volunteer, and decided to take the leap from working as a career civil servant, which is the type of government employee, as you know, that doesn't switch from administration to administration, to a political appointee. And so in 2009, the president and his staff appointed me to be the senior advisor for media and public affairs over at Customs and Border Protection, as you noticed. So I was there for a year or two. I went back to the White House, and then eventually I looked at the clock and said, there's only a couple years left in the Obama administration. I really want to do something interesting and different and kind of crisis communication centered. And I had seen Craig on the news. I had seen the reputation that FEMA had regained after Katrina and the president's commitment to the agency and making it an important agency again. And I wanted to jump in. So that's when I went over to FEMA, which is in, I think, 2014. So that's how I got introduced to emergency management. Basically.
So I'm so excited to talk about the FEMA stuff. Before we get there, I just want to work the story a little bit. So when you went from civil service into the Obama administration, is that a terrifying transition to suddenly be involved in the politics? Because clearly nobody can fire a government employee, but as soon as you're a political appointee, you could be thrown out at any time.
I can't tell you how right you are on that. And my parents, when I told them what I was doing, they said, "You're crazy. What are you doing?" And what I had seen though before, having worked at the White House as a career person, is I'd seen these political appointees come through and just be able to do amazing things, travel the world, travel the nation, be able to influence policy and change things. So I knew going in that it was going to be either a 4-year deal or an 8-year deal, and maybe even less if something happened. If you like you said, you can get fired as a political appointee with really no cause. But looking back, it was a decision I would make all over again. It led to really amazing things, and I got to work with really amazing people and do really, really amazing things. So I'm one of the few people who've been able to do kind of both sides of the coin. But you're right, it is a terrifying decision, but it's one I'd make all over again.
Now, what about the flip of that, when you went from the White House to FEMA? Because I imagine when you're at the White House, you make a phone call, you need something done, it gets done. You're calling from the White House. But then to move on the civil service side, suddenly you don't have the backing of the White House. Was that a tough transition for you?
When I left the White House, I was considering what I told myself is that I wanted to. I had a very short list of other cabinet agencies that I wanted to go work for, but I made an exception to that, and there were two other agencies that were not cabinet level that I would consider working for because I knew the stature they had in the administration, and one of them was FEMA. And so, actually going to FEMA from the White House was not that much different in terms of kind of contact I had with senior White House officials and the amount of bandwidth that we were afforded to do our jobs and to make things happen. And it really is true that President Obama and his national security staff, everyone, had so much confidence in FEMA, had so much confidence in Craig, that it wasn't an exercise of the White House telling FEMA what to do during a disaster. It was the White House turning to Craig and to senior staff at FEMA and saying, what should we be doing? How bad is this? What do we need to do? And to be in that position, to be trusted with that kind of agency and with that kind of influence was probably the highlight of my career. It was the one agency where I was able to see the most of that and have the most contact with those senior officials, believe it or not, even having worked at the White House.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing. I mean, to think about FEMA and the turnaround it did after Katrina, that is pretty incredible.
Yeah, I think there were a couple of years there where nobody was taking any phone calls from FEMA. Even FEMA was not
taking phone calls from FEMA. And, I was working in emergency management back then, too, and it was kind of embarrassing to be an emergency manager. And the turnaround that you guys did at FEMA is just an incredible story. Someone should write a book about that.
So maybe we can dig into that in depth a little bit, and in particular, Talk about that post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act. I know you came in sort of after that, but I think in some of the stuff you've read, you've really told the story of what it took to turn FEMA around. And so I wonder if you could talk some about that and what the culture was like coming into it.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So this is one of those things that you probably don't see much in Washington these days, which is that there really was a bipartisan effort to fix FEMA, and so what happened during Katrina didn't happen again. And the truth is that you can't pin all the blame on FEMA. FEMA kind of took the PR hit. It was the punchline on all the late night jokes. It had a huge reputation hit after Katrina. But the post-Katrina Emergency Reform Act was huge because Democrats and Republicans came together and said, look, this is an agency that had no authorization. It wasn't appropriately funded. It was an agency that was basically signed into existence via executive order with no statutory authority. We need to change that. We need to make sure that the FEMA administrator is actually somebody who has emergency management experience. And so, as much as and Craig
what a novel idea!
Oh my God.
Craig would be the first one to tell you that it wasn't just it wasn't him, although I think he does get a lot of the credit, but it was before he actually came in. And then when he came in, people kind of saw his philosophy, his track record working for a Republican governor, not caring about the politics, not having any patience for the bureaucracy, and then kind of move forward from there. So I think it's a lot of different people deserve credit for that.
So we're just going to then, ultimate Craig fanboys that we are, we're going to take a breath, and then I'm going to ask you the most important question. I'm just letting the anticipation build. So here it is. Here it is, Rafael. Think big, go fast, be smart about it. What was it like working for Craig? What is that experience like?
It was, I'll tell you, as somebody who's worked in Washington for so long, it was a very different experience compared to anyone else I've worked for before. With Craig, what you see is what you get. And he's this very interesting paradox. I'll tell you kind of a quick story. When I first met him, it was my first week at FEMA, and I had been used to working for members of the cabinet, senior administration officials, who I had to go into meetings with, prepped, with talking points, telling them what to do, prepared to, kind of answer any question they had about, like, what if I get asked this by the press? What if this comes up? What do I say? That kind of thing. First time I met him, I went into his office, and we were going to prep him for an interview with USA Today about something. And he kind of made an offhand joke about what he wanted to say, but really, it wasn't really, PC, because it was not what you typically hear from a Washington politician. And I just kind of jokingly said, well, I don't think I'd say that. And he turns to me, he looks me in the eye, and he says, the best way to get me to say something is to tell me not to say it. And I was terrified because I had no contact with him whatsoever. And it turns out he was the first boss I'd ever worked for who, instead of me having to give talking points to, he would give them to me and to the rest of the staff, and we would follow his lead. So again, what you see is what you get with Craig. He is somebody who has no patience for bureaucracy. He's kind of this paradox in that, he's from Florida. He's an outsider from a Washington outsider, but he understands how Washington works really well. He's kind of this Southerner, but he's also an intellectual. I've learned a tremendous amount from him, and FEMA was really lucky to have him for as long as they did.
Yeah, that's amazing. It locks it in for me. He's my favorite.
Well, maybe let's talk a little bit about what your job in that role, because I think it's fair to say traditionally public affairs, crisis communications is something that emergency management wrestles with, right? I mean, it didn't come out of that. That's not necessarily in the DNA, but it's such an important part of the job. As the director of public affairs there, what were you doing? What was your day-to-day?
A lot of it is managing expectations. I think and you guys know this because you guys are in the field, when most people think about FEMA, they think about the folks with the windbreakers that are out, that when something happens, they're immediately on the ground, feeding people and putting people back in their homes. But the truth, that's
tactical
not
pants.
really
I
how.
just want to mention the tactical pants.
That's right.
With a lot of pockets.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's not really how disasters work, as you guys know. Most of the disaster response happens at the state and local level. And so FEMA really only gets called in for immediate response when something really big happens. And most of the work is long-term recovery. So as a public affairs director, I had to deal a lot with the phone calls from national and local press asking, where is FEMA? Where is FEMA? And being in that awkward position where I had to explain that FEMA is not a lead agency when it comes to disaster response. We work for the states. We support states in what they do. Let me explain to you how the Stafford Act works and how the declaration process works. So a lot of it had to do with that. But during the big disasters like Matthew or the flooding in Louisiana or West Virginia and the Flint water crisis, it is actually a lot of making sure that we're out there telling our story as aggressively as possible, because as far as we've come to shed the Katrina disaster brand, a lot of reporters still have that in the back of their heads, and they're ready to go at somebody when something goes wrong and when a disaster can't be fixed quickly. So as Director of Public Affairs, it was kind of my job to find ways to communicate as quickly and as effectively as we could to make sure we were telling our story about how we're supporting the states and their partners, and not making it about politics. Even though I was a political appointee, we made a point. And, credit to Craig and his staff, there were people who worked at FEMA who were political appointees that I, as a political appointee, didn't even know they were political appointees. So there was no distinction between the career staff and the politicals at FEMA to a large extent. So telling that story, I think, was the most important thing. I will say that flood insurance and the controversy surrounding flood insurance was something that actually took up a lot of my time. It's something people don't associate with FEMA, but that's kind of just an aside, and I'd be happy to talk to you guys about flood insurance.
Yeah, I think we'll get into that in a little bit. I'm curious, just kind of into the weeds of how information flowed, at FEMA. I think, Mitch and I both work in emergency management at the local level, and it's difficult for us in emergencies to get accurate, timely, regular information on what's happening. And I just think of an organization like FEMA that, how did you go about, as a director of public affairs, getting accurate, up-to-date information from the field to you to brief out? Kind of what did that process look like, and how did you institute a system so that you were briefed and prepared to both brief Craig so he could brief the White House and kind of brief national media?
Yeah, I think, and not being a career emergency manager, I don't know if this is common standard practice in states and local emergency operations centers, but everything that happened at FEMA during a disaster was open information. When there was a senior leadership briefing with state and local folks during a disaster, over a video teleconference, it was open to everyone at the agency. Anybody can turn on Channel 13 at FEMA and watch what was being said. So if you wanted the latest information that was coming in, everybody had the opportunity to have it, in addition to kind of having your own component office representation inside of the National Response and Coordination Center. I've never worked at another agency where that's been the case, where it's totally open. And it really speaks to, I think, Craig's philosophy on opening the data and making as much government, his philosophy was, unless something is a state secret, it should be open to everybody in the world to have. It should be open data. And he really lived by that philosophy. I remember one time I went new to FEMA. A reporter had asked me about something that I had heard during one of those senior leadership briefings. He was on a tight deadline. It was a national reporter. I couldn't find my boss at the time. I went straight to Craig's office. I walked in, and he was in there with his chief of staff. And I said, Craig, I have a reporter from so-and-so asking me about something that we talked about during the senior leadership briefing. Is it okay if I let him have that information? And he just looks up for me from behind his glasses and his iPad, and he said, Well, I said it, didn't I?
What I love about that,
as you back out slowly,
and I'm going to rant about that for a second, because that is absolutely textbook critical in emergency management, is that open flow of every bit of information. Maybe it seems important, maybe it doesn't, maybe people want to keep it close to the vest, maybe they don't, but it's all got to get out there to create this ecosystem of knowledge, and nobody does it. Everybody is too chicken to do that in emergencies because they're worried somebody will misconstrue it or anything like that. But
they're worried about saying the wrong thing.
That's right.
Everybody's hearing this. I got to be really, really careful about what I say.
I've got to speak really slowly and say nothing specific.
Right.
Yeah, and so the fact that FEMA was able to do that is so important and great.
Yeah, and look, I mean, reporters are, especially in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, they're dying for information. And you want, right at the outset, you want to be able to establish yourself as a reliable source of information, and you want to start showing measurable progress. So this doesn't mean giving out unreliable information. Sometimes you'll get numbers of things that are not fully consistent with the fuller picture because reporting hasn't occurred yet or whatever. A lot of this is within discretion, but overall the philosophy should always be maximum disclosure with minimum delay.
So let's take a second and dive into this flood insurance issue, because I think especially for our audience, and I'll tie both the disaster deductible idea and the flood insurance together because they both deal with this idea of mitigation. Right. And you, Rafael, correct me. But I mean, one of the things about flood insurance is, that program was created to ensure people to live in areas that are kind of high risk. And the government is giving it to them so they can afford to recover from a disaster. But it also creates this incentive for more people to live in areas that are risky, that may get overrun by water. And I wonder if you can talk some about your efforts to communicate that effort clearly, and how Craig's disaster deductible idea, which is also about mitigation, I think, sort of ties into that communication philosophy.
Yeah, well, as you guys know, I mean, dollar for dollar, the more money you spend on mitigation, the less you're going to spend in the long run on disaster recovery. Flood insurance is one of these things a lot of people don't understand. And part of that is because it's complicated. The other part is because Congress has been a little schizophrenic when it comes to what their vision is with flood insurance. You guys know, I think it was in the 1920s or early part of that century where there was a significant flood. Basically, private insurance companies that were providing flood insurance went bankrupt because they figured out something we now know as fact, which is that flooding is really the most common and expensive disaster there is, which is why the federal government got involved in the flood insurance game in the first place. So the flood insurance program was originally, when it was established in the 1960s, was basically a program to subsidize people who couldn't afford flood insurance and lived in certain areas, those high flood risk areas, to get flood insurance a little bit over time. And what you've seen over the past 5, 7, 10 years is a move away from subsidizing people's flood insurance to making the program actuarially sound, meaning people are going to have to pay their full risk rate. And that's created a lot of heartburn because people who live in floodplains where, frankly, we shouldn't be building homes are going to see flood insurance rates go up very, very high. And that's not popular on the Hill. So what we have now is a flood insurance program that's managed by FEMA that is effective, and I think it's doing a good job in terms of paying people out. But I think where there needs to be work done is kind of educating folks on, and communities, frankly, on where there should be smarter development and why you shouldn't build in certain areas. And there was a bit of a crisis with the program after Hurricane Sandy, which you guys may have heard. Well, you guys have heard from New York, so you guys know, where there were some allegations of fraud and corruption within some of the people who were servicing flood insurance. So it's been a very complicated program that's needed. And one of the things FEMA is trying to do, though, is encourage people in the private sector to come into the business of providing flood insurance. This isn't something FEMA necessarily wants a monopoly on. So it's a very interesting issue. I never thought I'd ever be somebody who worked in flood insurance or become a spokesman for the flood insurance program, but that was one of the benefits of working at FEMA, I suppose.
So what would it take for private insurance companies to start offering flood insurance again?
Well, that's a good question, because something that they can make money off of,
Right.
because if they can't do that, obviously they're not going to do it out of the goodness of their heart. So right now, FEMA is taking a look at how to incentivize private insurance companies to do that. The way is to just encourage more private insurance companies to take part in the National Flood Insurance Program. I mean, they actually do make money by partnering with FEMA because they take a percentage of that commission for selling and servicing policies. So it's an ongoing effort, but it's very complicated and frankly very politically charged, given the influence of the Hill and the special interest groups that are involved in this.
I'm gonna go deeply into the weeds. To say, I know, right? So deep into the policy weeds. But one of the best things that I felt like FEMA did well and messaged well in the flood insurance program was the creation of high-risk pools. Was looking at that small percentage of people who had flood insurance who got multiple hits, who were flooded out over and over again. And I think, Rafael, you can correct me, but they created then a special category for those folks that were getting most of the payoffs. And by kind of grouping out those higher risk pools, it starts to make the rest of the group look actuarially better for people because they're a little bit less of a risk. So tiering it, I felt like was a great idea from a policy perspective.
Yeah, and I think that data is really, you're referring to the severe repetitive loss properties.
That's right.
That just get flooded over and over again. And story here, insurance, which everyone has, regardless if you live in a special high flood hazard area. A big piece of FEMA's mission that people don't know is providing millions and millions of dollars, not just after disasters, but just overall throughout the annual budget process for mitigation, things like buyouts. So encouraging cities and communities to actually take a look at areas where you see those severe repetitive loss properties and say, look, we're going to buy your homes. If we all have to come into agreements, we're not going to take over your homes. But clearly, hopefully this community sees what's happening here. We want to buy your homes at a reasonable market value. Soccer field or something that's expensive. And hopefully help folks relocate. So there's a lot that happens on the mitigation front that isn't as sexy as response and recovery, but it's just as important, if not more important, than what the rest of the managers do.
For me, mitigation is the sexiest of the emergency management phases.
So sexy.
Rafael, I'm going to warn you, during that last bit, your phone started to go in and out a little bit if you're in a weak signal location by chance. Do you want to ask about disaster deductibles?
Well, I just, just to mention on the disaster deductible that, I love the idea that states would pay more, almost a deductible, when these disasters would hit, but they would receive more funds or more credits toward the deductible if they were making investments in, say, good building codes and mitigation efforts that were being followed. So there would be this local incentive to, for mitigation and for preparedness. I think that makes sense. It's kind of a model that follows car insurance. The safer you drive, the lower you pay for insurance. And I think it's something that's easily understood by people.
Yeah, and this is another Craig Fugate special. He came up with this idea. And what spurred to come up with the idea was we're getting a lot of FEMA by the Hill and by the Government Accountability Office and kind of budget watchers that disasters were getting more and more expensive. And there's a Heritage report that said that there's a disaster declared every 2.8 days, like $100 billion on disasters over a 10-year period. Worse, the way the disaster relief fund is calculated, that's the pot of money that we use to pay for disasters, is on a 10-year rolling average. And we haven't had a huge disaster. Katrina, we've had Sandy and a few others, but nothing as big as that, which means that the rolling average is lower. So basically what Craig said was, look, we can either come up with our own solution on how to cut disaster costs and incentivize mitigation, or we can let the Hill and lawmakers do it for us. And the way they're going to do it, no one's going to like. And what they proposed and what was kind of bandied about on the Hill to impose on FEMA and to impose on states is to raise the per capita threshold for qualifies for a major disaster declaration. And in some cases by tripling it. So clearly that would have been it may still be an option. It's a huge burden on states because they would get far less money.
Yeah.
But was, why don't we find a way around this? Why don't we come up with this concept of a deductible where instead of going back and paying a state pays for on a disaster, which is the way disaster declaration currently works, why don't we say to states, you have to kind of pony up a certain amount of dollars on your end before you get the rest of the federal money? A couple of things. First, obviously it would save costs. It would kind of states, but we live in a federalist world, so that's actually a conservative libertarian argument for that. But secondly, it would actually incentivize states to take action to mitigate against future disasters. They wouldn't, in other words, treat FEMA like an insurance company where, we know FEMA's going to be there to rescue us, so why do we have to invest in new building codes? And actually, if they took those steps under our proposal, that might actually count toward the deductible. So it doesn't mean you actually have to spend dollars in or have your own individual assistance program. And so that was the concept as we left it at the end of the Obama administration to see if takes that on.
So to me, there are a couple of key benefits of this approach. I saw a lot of proposals in something like the mid-90s. Emergency managers got fed up bailing states out over and over again. And so some emergency managers were proposing things like if a state's building codes aren't up to par, they get nothing from the Stafford Act. I mean, the feds are just not going to bail them out. And from the other side, you would see people who wanted to declare more and more disasters, and they would say, well, how do we stop federal declarations of disasters or cut them down? The great thing about this deductible approach, I think, is that it kind of solves both problems. It creates this state buffer, but it's based on incentives and not punishments. So I think the optics are better, first of all, and also it gives states themselves an incentive to declare fewer disasters, right? And so it kind of pushes the mechanism of that. Congressmen don't have to sort of fight for it anymore. The states themselves want to control it, right? So I think it's a great policy proposal for both those reasons.
Yeah, and I hope it moves forward in the new administration. I think the challenge is, one, the uncertainty with the new administration. We don't know what they're going to think of the proposal. But two, even when we just broached the subject, there was pushback from state authorities, which I guess wasn't altogether surprising because at the end of the day, it does require states to do more and spend more money. But again, going back to Craig's point, the solution on this, or Congress is just going to do something more drastic. And so we got to find a way to make this work for the survivors and for support mitigation.
That's right.
All right, so we're going to dive in, I think, to a couple of case studies now, just a couple of the midnight phone calls, the crises that you did, but I'm just going to pause just a second for station identification, as if we had like a station or something.
I mean, personally, I could talk about flood insurance for another 2 hours, but I don't know if our listeners so maybe we talk about
Sorry, I got to go put my house up on stilts. I don't know if I can stick around. So I want to talk about Flint first off, because to me, we talk a lot about crisis communication, risk communication, but I feel like the Flint water crisis in particular put FEMA in a really tough spot. It was a really difficult, just looking at it from the outside, really tough thing to message, and it was a tough, particularly because my sense was FEMA didn't really have standing in that event in the same way you would in a natural disaster Stafford declaration. So how did you get involved in that?
You nailed it. You asked what a big part of my job was at FEMA's public affairs director. Again, explaining to people how the Stafford Act works, what qualifies a disaster. People often see something really bad happen, we'll call FEMA in. And we saw this happen over and over and over again. We saw Governor Scott ask us for money for green algae. We got politicians in, I think, Connecticut asking us for money for crumbling home foundations because of faulty cement. You name it. And Flint was one of those areas where it was maybe not so clear cut. As you guys know, the Stafford Act basically basically allows for federal disaster funding in certain cases, natural disasters, or cases of fire and flood during a terrorist event, I think it is, or something, or fires or flood, regardless of the cause, or something along those lines. So the Flint issue was an interesting one, because clearly what had happened was this was a man-made event where there was contamination in the water. And so we had to struggle for a bit at FEMA, saying, like, what's our role here? How can we support this within the confines of the Stafford Act? And the bottom line is the president asked us to make this a priority, and we did. And so one of the things we did was we gave a limited declaration for limited items, including water, some filters, and a few other things. We were able to kind of find a way there, in addition to helping with long-term recovery kind of organization. But it was an interesting case study.
Yeah, I kind of love that about FEMA under Craig, and how, I think it speaks to the local perspective that he brought, where someone would come to him with a problem, and where you would help out. You saw it there in Flint. You saw it in kind of the border crisis that was going on in the southern United States, where it wasn't a traditional kind of disaster that FEMA covered, but at the same time, there's a need. We have resources. We have expertise. Let's figure out how to respond within the bureaucracy and the rules.
So one thing I saw in the Flint situation in particular was that there was a strong local message that was there. There were advocates that were there. The state was then playing kind of a different version of that story, and then obviously Congress and you guys, FEMA, were trying to craft a message that was honest, I think, and clear, but that didn't really resonate with those other more partial communities, if that makes sense. How did you work with the locals, or did you work with the state to try and get on the same message? Were you part of the Joint Information Center for Flint? How did that actually work from a messaging perspective?
Yeah, so that's the beauty of ESF 15 and the emergency management system, which is, as somebody like me who had no experience for the rest of my life, and that's why, frankly, they put Craig and FEMA in charge of these other kind of half man-made disasters, half political disasters, like the immigration problem at the border, is that when you have something like that happen, the emergency managers know immediately how to scale up a system where everyone's working together. They recognize who's really in charge, which is often not the Fed, and how to bring everybody from the interagency together so that you're not just, out there on your own. So with Flint, that system, we stood it up. Yes, we had a JIC that we helped kind of inform and stand up, but it was led by HHS, which was the lead agency Flint crisis. It wasn't FEMA. And same thing during the border crisis. That was an instance where we set up the battle rhythm and structure on how the emergency support functions would work, and we kind of worked with the rest of the interagency to kind of work within that system, because we know I do crisis communications now, and that's something that I'm going to take with me for the rest of my career.
So when you guys do that, and I'm just going to say, can I just say this, Rafael, as a former employee of Customs and Border Patrol, if y'all had just built a wall back then,
none of that would have happened.
Why
nobody would have come across. I don't know what the issue is.
Maybe let's go to Matthew for a second, because Matthew, I'm from Georgia. Matthew is a personal storm for me. I worked in Florida. It hit a lot of my old stomping grounds, and I feel like FEMA did really an exceptional job across states in that. And I want to focus in particular on the social media challenges, because I think you were really leading the charge in terms of things like Snapchat, things like Twitter, things like Facebook, and coordinating this massive disaster response
Tinder.
social media campaign. That's right. Yeah, Tinder, Grindr, everything all turned up.
It's amazing.
OkCupid. So can you talk about what that's like, coordinating a crisis communications campaign in a disaster response, and how you scaled it up?
Well, we knew going into hurricane season that you had to kind of use every tool in the toolbox. Obviously, you had to continue communicating through mainstream national media, local media, but increasingly people obviously are using and relying on social media. And Craig is a huge leader, kind of a social media geek, if you will. He has his own Twitter presence, always has been, has pushed the agency to do more on social. So one of the things we did ahead of Matthew was it was a bit of a forcing function where we kind of saw new opportunities to get this preparedness message out that maybe we hadn't thought about before. And one of them was Snapchat. And we reached out to contacts there, and they kind of walked us through how to submit content from our National Response Coordination Center on, delivering preparedness tips. And they would feature those tips on their Snapchat stories, which received millions of views. It was amazing to us to see that. And so to be on those platforms that particularly millennials are relying more on was a huge eye-opener for us, and I think is now going to be standard practice looking forward for FEMA. At least I hope it will be.
Yeah, you guys set a great example, and I think one of the benefits of Snapchat is I think communities now and people crave authenticity, and there's no filter when you use Snapchat. It's coming directly. Snapchat. Sorry, I put the weird emphasis on that. But it's coming straight from the government official, to people. And I think people appreciate that direct message.
I mean, I've tried to use Snapchat a lot. I mean, I just have to be honest, I can't figure it out. Like, I downloaded
you're
it.
Old.
I turned it on.
You're no Craig Fugate.
My kids,
Mitch.
I know, I will never be Craig Fugate. He's like the second craziest tweeter in the world. But honestly, what was that like? Did you face a lot of concern inside the emergency management community for the Snapchat thing because people just didn't understand it, that we're part of the target audience?
It's really funny, and this is kind of a lesson for up-and-coming bureaucrats. We kind of hacked the system. If it was a slow week, or if we weren't in hurricane season, or nothing was happening, and I would have asked, for permission to use Snapchat, we would have had to go through a ton of red tape.
Yeah.
Approvals by the lawyers, privacy policies, this and that, all that kind of stuff. During a disaster, all that kind of red tape has a tendency to go away, and certainly Fugate doesn't have any tolerance for it. So a lot of stuff that you saw FEMA do on social media happened because Craig wanted to do it during disasters. And no one was going to say to Craig, you can't go on Facebook Live because the lawyers haven't had a chance to review whether or not that's appropriate. He would just do it. And then once he did it, we would do it. And then, I've been working with social media my entire federal career, and I have never seen anybody get in trouble for using social media. Of course, you got to use discretion and be smart about it. But the bottom line is that if you want something to get done, it can get done. And a big part of that is having an administrator and leadership that understands the value of it. And that's what I think Craig brought to the table.
And I think I do a little bit feel like we're brown-nosing Craig Fugate here. So if he ever randomly listens to this, I just want you to know we would be tough on you if given the opportunity. But the other thing I really want to credit you guys for in the Matthew response in terms of a communication strategy was both the sort of the courage and the transparency to get the people in FEMA up there in front of the locals who are not always the easiest crowd, and to really be honest. I remember Beth Zimmerman, who is one of the Craig's deputies, doing kind of live web conversations with local stakeholders, really digging into the real issues, not being afraid to commit to things on what were essentially public communication channels like that. Was there anything that had to be done to instill that kind of communications courage throughout the organization?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked that question. So we had done Facebook Live before, but we had not had Beth Zimmerman do it. Most of the time it had been Craig Fugate doing it, or I would go on camera and do it. And people kind of get skittish when you introduce kind of a new thing, like, okay, I'm going to be on camera, but it's through your phone and it's for Facebook. Isn't that where kids hang out and gossip and share family photos? Beth Zimmerman had not been on Facebook when we had asked her to do it, so she knew Facebook was a thing, but she wasn't like a huge Facebook person. So we kind of had to walk her through it, and basically we just told her, just be yourself. You're the expert on this. We'll put you on camera. We'll ask you questions. You just answer them. There's no real prep beyond that we had to do. She loved it so much. She joined Facebook. She told all her friends about it. And we're Facebook friends now. We talk over Facebook all the time. But it was, again, another one of those things where it was like, there's a disaster going on. Let's grab Beth, put her in front of the camera. It was a forcing function. And it was great because, again, there was such a thirst for information on what FEMA was doing. We could do a news release that needs to get cleared, or we can do, phone calls to media. But doing those Facebook posts were incredibly valuable. They were cheap, easy, and quick.
I think these are such important lessons for emergency managers at every level, right? These are cheap tools. You just have to have sort of the courage and the discipline to get out there and stay on message. So it's Facebook Live, Snapchat. I mean, I think these are things any ground level emergency manager can pick up.
And I think also, you need a person on that end of the camera who kind of knows what they're talking about, has enough experience to kind of know what to say and what not to say. So that was another.
And I think that you've got to be competent. I mean, I think if you're competent, you're fine, but it does, I think, expose incompetence.
Yep.
So all of you incompetent listeners out there, you should be worried.
Don't use Snapchat.
All right. So, Rafael, we're going to just take a breather here, and then we're going to come back, and you're going to have to go through our lightning round.
Awesome. Can't wait.
Well, thanks again for joining us. I feel like we kind of barely scratched the surface of your career. There were a lot of areas that we didn't touch on, like the FEMA app and some of the other great things that we did, that you did during FEMA. But maybe we can have you back on sometime and talk about some other aspects.
Yeah, and the FEMA app, frankly, that was another Craig Fugate special. It was his idea to come up with it. And then a year, actually about 6 months before the end of the administration, he said, I want you to double the number of people who have downloaded the FEMA app since we invented it. And we said, that's crazy. That's impossible. But eventually we got there. But it was quite a task. And that's kind of a thing that Craig does, which is he gives people these impossible tasks. And people think they can't do them. And even if they get halfway there, it's far beyond the expectation that most people have. So it was an interesting case study.
We should throw down. Like, honestly, Andrew, you got to double the number of people that have downloaded Dukes of Hazzard podcast.
I want you to double the listeners right now.
Right now, 15 minutes. All right, let's go lightning round.
Okay, so, Rafael, what is your favorite hazard?
Oh, God, I would love to say coronal mass ejections, but yeah, one of my favorite things was being quoted as saying that one time. But I think I have to go with flooding just because I've been through so much of that kind of disaster. Floods.
Yeah, that's a good one. I think, Craig should challenge you one time to, like, in your next press conference to use coronal mass injections, as part of your answer.
Say that 3 times fast. All right. What's the hazard that scares you the most?
Also floods, believe it or not.
Really? That's interesting. I think that's the first flood answer we've gotten on that question.
Yeah. No, actually, you know what? What scares me the most is the dreaded Craig Fugate Thunderbolt exercise. Does that count?
Can we just take a second?
We can't. Save it for the next time. Yeah, okay. We'll save that one. So what's the first disaster you remember? Not necessarily that you worked or responded to, but that you remember.
Hurricane Andrew. I grew up in South Florida, and I remember my family had moved to Virginia from South Florida in 1989, so we missed Hurricane Andrew. But I saw, my grandmother still had a house there, so I remember that disaster quite clearly, even though I was little, about 13 years old, I guess.
Wow. So then what was the first major disaster that you yourself worked in any capacity?
I'd have to say the South Carolina flooding. I think it was 2015 or so. That was, I would say, the first big one.
So what's your favorite disaster movie? It doesn't have to be a traditional disaster movie. It could be, some movie with a disaster in it.
Does Sheely count as a disaster movie?
It certainly was a disaster.
It was for Ben Affleck. So I guess we'll there was no flooding, but still we'll do it. So do you know anything about ICS? Do you know enough for us to ask you an ICS question?
Probably not.
Okay.
But I want you to ask me anyway, just to see if I can answer it.
Okay. What is your favorite position in the incident command structure?
Safety officer.
Oh, that's good. What's the worst position? What's the one position you would not want for $1 million?
SCO. Is that a position?
Federal court. It's not, but that would be a horrible job.
I think that is probably like the position that gets the most crap of any position.
It would be an amazing job, but so tough.
So can we assume your favorite emergency management gear is the windbreaker, or is there something else that you feel like is better?
Oh, man, that's a really good question. I had these fantasies of, like, when I went to go work at FEMA that I'd be able to, like, wear my windbreaker around town and, like, tell people what to do. Of course, I would never do that, but but I guess it'd be the FEMA jacket. I mean, it doesn't get much better than that.
Did they let you keep the? Do you still have the jacket?
Did they rip it off of you when you left?
No, they don't. And frankly, after having worn those, through a few disasters, I don't think that anybody's even going to want to take them back, even at a Goodwill. So I still have them. I guess I just wear them to bed.
That's great. Now, did you ever get any off-the-wall, like, Black Flag, FEMA conspiracy theory type questions, or...
Did we stage the moon landing?
All the time. It's funny. I mean, it's not just FEMA. It's like anywhere else. Each cabinet agency has their own version of it. Of course, ours is the FEMA camps and the Alex Jones InfoWars crazy people. I kind of joke around with Craig about this kind of behind the scenes. He said, my last interview, I want to call into the Alex Jones show and say, Mr. Jones, you have 30 minutes. I am sending all of your listeners to FEMA camp. Start running. And I thought he was joking. And of course he never did it, but he did do an interview with, I forget who it was, when he was feeling pretty liberated toward the end of the administration, and he kind of joked about it. But, it's a lot of those crazies we had to deal with.
Yeah, that theory will not die. My first internship in undergraduate was at FEMA Region 6 in Denton, Texas, and I believe it was the last FEMA regional office that they built as a bomb shelter underground, because it had this civil defense component. It was built in the 60s, but it just contributed to this. I mean, I remember walking around town and people be like, "You intern at FEMA? They have, they just all sorts of crazy conspiracy."
Were you
theories.
wearing a windbreaker?
I didn't get it as an intern. I did not get a windbreaker. I was very disappointed. I didn't get paid or a windbreaker.
Yeah, we actually had to have like a stock response for the emails that we got to respond to those folks. It's pretty sad, and a lot of that, frankly, it's gone mainstream, which is crazy. Like, I think a lot of people just take it as fact, which is sad. But anyway.
Well, Rafael, it's been great having you on. I know one day we're going to meet in our FEMA trailers when we all have to live there together. And we'll have to have you back on sometime to talk about Thunderbolts.
Yeah, and actually those FEMA trailers are bigger than our New York City apartment, so I would definitely go for one.
Oh, that's true. That's true. We could stack them on top of each other. Just 20 stacks high. It'll be awesome.
All right, Rafael, thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
All right, well, thanks for listening, listeners. That was another great episode. I don't know why it's suddenly becoming really formal.
Thanks for listening, listeners.
Thanks for listening, listeners. Man. So, as always, you can follow us on Twitter, Hazards Podcast. You can call us and ask us a question, 859-429-2731. Ask us a question, give us suggestions for what you want to hear, who you want to have on the show. We'd love to hear more.
And we're on Twitter at Hazards Podcast.
Yeah,
at Hazards Podcast. But you know what? Oh, did you?
Yeah, I did.
I wasn't listening. I kind of stopped listening back at.
No,
But what we don't have is a Snapchat channel, or
That's
is it?
true.
Are they called channels?
I don't know.
There's Snapchat
We're so
stories.
old.
I know. So we need a Snapchat thingamajig.
We have to get like good-looking people to play us on Snapchat.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Because if it's me sweating in a 90-degree New York City apartment, we're not going to get many followers.
Okay, so call us or tweet us and ask us what you would like the model versions of the Dukes to do on our Snapchat channel. And we'll totally do that because we've got so many models hanging around ready to do whatever we say at any time. Now we're going to have to go hire some models.
Should be hard in the city.
There are a lot. Yeah, there's a lot. They're like all over the place.
You have a lot of model friends, right?
Oh, yeah. All of them. Most of them work for FEMA.